Yeah, hello. My name's Luke McBain. I'm here with my brother Chad, and we talk about Bitcoin. And hi, Chad. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm pretty good. It's been a while since we talked about Bitcoin. And we
Hmm.
just yeah, a couple of years actually. Actually, so a lot has happened in the meanwhile, and we just had another all-time high. And I thought, well, this is a good opportunity to talk again about Bitcoin and yeah, what has happened since the last time we had this hype.
Right.
And I think we already talked a little bit, and you had a number of interesting observations. Yeah, so like, has anything actually changed in regards to Bitcoin, or what's going on? Why did we see now an all-time high?
Well, I think from the last time we talked, which probably was a couple of years ago now, um, I think a lot has probably changed. Not really for Bitcoin. Bitcoin just keeps doing what it does. But I think in terms of perception, both public, institutional, governmental, legislatively, so a lot has changed. And I guess we'll just summarize maybe and then maybe tackle some of these one by one. But I would just, in summary, I would say what's changed over the last couple of years. So, we saw the top, I think, in late 2021, so probably about 2.5 years ago. The last time was close to 70,000. I think it was 69,000 or something like that. And then it went all the way down to, and these are US dollars, obviously, I'm quoting. Then it went all the way down to I think around 15, 16 at one point in late 22, which is actually when I bought some more. um, so spoiler alert, that kind of tells you how I feel about it. From 70 down to 15, and I bought more at 15. But anyway, but in that time, obviously, it's come back, and we're having new all-time highs now, and we have exchange traded products out there in the market from many big institutions now. But I also think in terms of the world, a lot has changed. I think a lot of people are really starting to not only feel it, I think they've been feeling it for a couple of years, but starting to actually learn a little bit about what inflation really means. And without getting into anything controversial, but when you shut down global economies for a long period of time, and then print a lot of money to try and band-aid over that. I'm not saying it was right or wrong. I'm just saying it is what happened. Um, that money, that excess money out there is causing the money that was already out there to become worth less in terms of its purchasing power. And I think people are experiencing that. And I think a lot of people think that prices are going up. And yes, technically, I guess they are. But what's really happening is the value of their dollar anywhere in the world um, is simply becoming less and less. And so people that kind of see this or feel it or experience it or start looking for places where they can put their money that hopefully doesn't lose value or at least not too much. And if they're lucky, then maybe gains value. So I think that's where we're at as a world right now. And I think a lot of people are turning to Bitcoin, they're turning to real estate, they're turning to gold and even silver and things like that. Things that are rare or scarce or in high demand. And Bitcoin is the digital version of that. So therefore, I think more and more people are becoming interested in it.
Yeah, but you sort of like heard that argument the last time around. I mean, I got interested in Bitcoin precisely for that reason, seeing how governments were spending money during the Corona crisis. And then Bitcoin dropped substantially, and its critics were saying, "Well, there you go. Bitcoin doesn't hedge for inflation. It's all nonsense. So it's not, it doesn't do that." So yeah, what makes you think it does do that? Maybe the horizon is chosen wrongly, that you're not hedging
Yeah.
against inflation in a matter of maybe 2 years, but maybe in a more in a time frame of 5 to 10 years, it can be
So
hedging against
I
inflation.
I would take that line of thinking. I mean, if you measure something in the course of days or weeks or even months, it's hard to see sometimes a difference. So there's a phrase in in the financial investing community called "When in doubt, zoom out."
Hmm.
And what that means is, when you're not quite sure, for instance, to your point, a lot of people say it's not an inflation hedge. I personally would disagree because I never looked at it as a 1 year thing or even a 2 year thing. Originally, when I got invested, I looked at it as a 5 year time horizon before I would really judge it. And now, actually, I think it's probably more realistic to look at it in a 10 year time horizon. As I get older, 5 years goes by faster than I remember. But even if you just take a few years, so to your point, it went from 50 or 70,000 roughly down to around 15, 16. And so people would say, well, that's not inflation hedge. And if you took that time period, let's say from September 2020 to September, October 2021, let's say a 12, 13-month time period, you would be correct. Or sorry, from the fall of 21 to the fall of 22, you'd be correct. But if you actually zoomed out and just looked at it from maybe the previous 5 years, it had gone from about $3,000 up to 70, back down to 15. So just anecdotally, I had a friend call me who's a skeptic, financially very savvy person, but a skeptic when it comes to Bitcoin. And at around, I'm going to say it was around 15, 16, $17,000 US. Let's say 16, 17, actually. It wasn't quite at the bottom. He said, have you sold yours yet? And I said, no. And he said, why not? And I said, well, first of all, I believe it's an alternative financial system. So there'd be no reason for me to sell it when, to me, it's another road. If we're traveling down a highway and there's a parallel highway and one has a lot of traffic on it and one doesn't, I'd rather take the one that's a lot of traffic. So I wasn't going to sell it because I view it as another financial system. But the second thing, in the way that he was thinking, I said, well, you're looking at it like I bought it at 20 or 30 or 40 or $50,000. And the truth of the matter is I bought it at much less than. So until it gets close to what I bought it at, I wouldn't sell. So that was the second thing. So for some people, it would get lower than what they bought it at. And maybe they sold, maybe they didn't. But at the time, remember, this is probably 2.5 years ago, I didn't probably understand as much as I even do now. So I didn't sell it then, thankfully. The way I considered it, the low that I started looking at it was $3,500. So the low in that situation was $16,000. So to me, that's an incredible inflation hedge, because the truth of the matter is that low in the fall of 22 was much higher than the previous low of, I think it was 2018. So again, zooming out, looking at it 4 years ago, what was the previous low? It was almost 1/5 of what it currently was. And another way to look at it, the low in 2022 was 75%, actually 80% of what the previous all-time high had been, which was 20,000. So we get distorted in moments, I think, which is your point. If we look at it in a 1 or 2 year thing, then maybe we say, oh, it's up and we're amazing and we're brilliant, or oh, it's down and oh my God, we're foolish and all. But if you zoom out, you say, well, it's much higher than its previous low. And matter of fact, this low is almost as high as the previous all-time high. And then, for me, I was like, oh, okay, well then actually this isn't anything to really concern yourself with. And luckily, and there was much more that went into that thinking, but that's kind of what I summed up with. And here we are. And whether, right now it's 70,000, that's fine. But within, I think, 4 months of that low that we're discussing, several US banks started to fail. And immediately, and when I say immediately, within 2, 3, 4 weeks, Bitcoin doubled in price. So it went from 15, 16 to 30,000. Again, US dollars we're talking. And it kind of stayed in that 30,000 range for many months. But my point is it rebounded from the low, the first sign of a banking crisis. Now, I don't know where that money came from. I don't know who was investing. I just know what it did. It reacted to that. And so, no, I don't get concerned with these fluctuations. And I think they're becoming, the fluctuations are maintaining, but what's becoming less and less, I believe, is the vast, I guess, diversity between the fluctuations. So in other words, I don't think we go from 70 to 15, maybe we go from 70 to 40, that kind of stuff in these fluctuations because of the institutional investments and because many governments around the world now finally, just in the last 6 to 12 months, actually have working financial regulations around this, which makes it much safer for a lot of people to they can feel safer in investing.
I guess what like puts off, I wouldn't say, I don't know how many people statistically, but just, speaking to people in my personal, network about Bitcoin, I think what puts people off are the fluctuations. So it's very difficult for them to accept that Bitcoin over the long run can be a hedge against inflation, because a hedge against inflation would mean that, yeah, you're basically, you have a store of value which increases steadily over time. Not maybe by big jumps, but maybe by 4% or
Right.
10% a year, like, and remain stable. And you can sort of like work off that assumption. Or maybe in terms of real estate, you have certain gains over the years, but you don't have these wild fluctuations. And that then appears as if it's purely speculative. And
Yeah.
talking just about, before we go into the question of regulations, I was just thinking, now that Bitcoin has, I don't know where it is right now, but it had overtaken silver in terms of market capitalization. So, one major global asset was overtaken, and you just look at that and you wonder what's going on. But silver doesn't have those fluctuations, not to my knowledge. So why? And it's also considered a fairly stable asset. And so why does one fluctuate to that degree and the other doesn't?
Well, I would say that one is several thousand years old and one is 15 years old.
Hmm.
And like anything that's young and new, like the internet, for instance, 20 years ago, um, it goes through, kind of the growing pains of growth. And I think with Bitcoin, as the network grows, you'll see those fluctuations dampen. I'm not going to say they're going to stop yet. I think they will stop in the coming years, um, but they are dampening. You probably won't see 95% fluctuations like they did 5, 6 years ago. Now you might see, I think worst case scenario is now 65 or 70% in the last big fluctuation. The next one, now that we have these products, might only be 35, 40%. But getting back to what you said earlier, I would challenge people to maybe challenge their premise on what they consider to be a hedge against inflation, because you're right. We use gold or silver and we say, oh, well, it's safe and it doesn't fluctuate much, and maybe you get a 3, 4, 5% return every year, then that seems like a hedge and it's safe and it's a store of value. The problem is inflation is much higher. So it's actually not a store of value. You're just losing your money slower, right? And so I think from that perspective, I think that people need to think about what is truly a store of value, something that loses money more slowly, or something that has wild fluctuations, but again, zooming out over a 2, 3, 4 year period, actually is not only storing your value and protecting it, but increasing it over time, you know? So I would argue that gold and silver, if you have, let's pick gold, it's probably more popular than silver. If you invested in gold in 2010, 2011, 2012, somewhere, let's say a decade or so ago, um, and you invested in it last week, the price hasn't changed. It was roughly at its peak $2,000 an ounce US 10, 12 years ago. And that's what it is today. Oh, so somebody could say, well, it's a store of value. Well, no, it isn't, because inflation over the last 10 years is about 40%. So you've actually lost 40% of your so-called uh, store of value. If you had $100,000 in gold in 2010, 11, 12, you now have 60,000 in purchasing power. It's just that simple. If you had 100, and I know it's not fair because Bitcoin was so young in 2012, but if you'd had 100,000 in Bitcoin in 2012, I don't know how many millions you'd have, but it would be tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars. Now that is the speculative part, so I don't want to go down that road. But even if you look at it from, let's say, 2020, let's say since the crisis, let's say, well, gold at the time was around $1,700-$1,800 an ounce, and Bitcoin was around, and I'm not going to take them from their low. I'm going to take them from what they were trading at just before the lockdown. Bitcoin is around 7,000. Gold is now around $2,000, $2,100, so about a 20% increase, and Bitcoin is 10x that. But even at its worst in the last 4 years, it was twice as much, or 100% increase. So at its worst in the last 4 years, it's increased 100%, and gold is up 20%. So if we can agree that inflation over the last 4 years is roughly 40%, gold being up 20% is not a store of value, and it's not a hedge. It's as simple as that. So I think because something is new and not as well understood and maybe well researched and well read, you can be pessimistic about it. But the truth of the matter is, if we just use math, and I'm no mathematician, but if we just use the math from numbers that other people put out, not me, it's completely the best store of value that we've had in the modern era. And again, I don't want to go back to 2010 because that's probably not fair. Let's just take it from the last 4 years when it was already an established thing, and there's nothing that compares to it. Real estate hasn't gone up that much in the last 4 years, even though people in most Western countries would say real estate is very expensive and rents are very expensive, and they're not wrong, but they haven't retained value nearly as well as something like that. So I think just zooming out and looking at it, at its worst, it was still up 100% from where it traded 4 years ago. And gold is up 20, and real estate is probably up around 35, 40, at least in Canada and the US. I can't speak to Europe.
I mean, also, what has happened since the last time was some regulation. And I remember like a couple of years back when I read also the Bitcoin standard and understanding a little bit better what Bitcoin is, that I thought, oh, wow, this is like alternative world currency, or it's an alternative reserve currency. It's an alternative to gold. It is actually some sort of monetary standard. And we could argue that point, but my concern was always that governments will not kindly look at Bitcoin because that takes away their ability to influence their own currencies if there's this alternative currency, let's call it that, if it is a currency. And I was always very, very worried about that. And then of course, you had always news of certain states then either banning Bitcoin or banning Bitcoin mining. For example, China banned Bitcoin mining and had been, I'm not quite sure, but I think up to that point, had been one of the prime locations for Bitcoin miners in the world. Right. And they just banned it outright. And two things were astonishing. First of all, that didn't even put a dent into Bitcoin. Like, they're basically, as if this hadn't happened, they just took up all their equipment and moved it somewhere else, and everything continued. And there was, basically nothing happened to Bitcoin, although this huge country just banned it. And then a second thing happened, which is fairly recent news this year, but maybe you also have more news, and which I thought influenced the price of Bitcoin, was the SEC in the United States approving these ETFs, which had been pending for years before that. And I thought, oh, if they're not approving these ETFs, that's a bad sign. I think there's something in the making. There's some attack on Bitcoin. Maybe there will be some anti-Bitcoin regulation coming out of the United States, or there's some attempt to destroy Bitcoin, although the Bitcoin enthusiasts would say that's totally impossible. You can't destroy it. Right. But I was worried, of course, as somebody who is invested in Bitcoin. I do tend to worry a lot. So I look at these negative news, and then suddenly they did approve the ETFs. And yeah, maybe talk
Yeah,
about that a little bit, because that sort of like impact the price. But that's, I believe also that sends a certain signal out to, I don't know, the world, to everybody else. It's taught, it's sort of reconfirms the whole Bitcoin hypothesis that there is going to be massive adoption by basically everybody. And we're seeing just now one of those steps, intermediate steps of Bitcoin adoption. So the whole Bitcoin hypothesis, the whole Bitcoin theory seems to be evolving as projected. Let me just put it that way.
yeah. Well, yeah. So there's a few things to take from that, but I guess first of all, yes, the Bitcoin community is correct. You can't stop it, but we're not going to get into that. What I would say is, even when China banned mining, yes, about 45% of the mining back, what, 3, 4 years ago was coming out of China because you could get cheap electricity out of China. When they banned it, what was interesting, it was a year after China banned it, because you can see all this, and we won't get too technical, but you can see the mining hash rate, um, basically online. The fact of the matter is even with China, the most totalitarian government probably on the planet, and certainly has the resources to carry out any of their edicts, still 12% of all Bitcoin mining globally was still coming out of China. So that just goes to show you can't really stop it. Now, I think more importantly, though, without getting into the weeds on that stuff, because I don't think that's probably too important to most people, uh, in regards to the legislative part, I think you're correct. I think there are many governments in the world that do fear it, because if Bitcoin was to take shape on a global standard, I guess, as a type of currency, or even a type of money that maybe backs a currency. So, as recently as the 1970s, gold actually backed the US dollar. Nothing backs the US dollar today, other than the full faith in the US government. But so take that for whatever you think it's worth. Um, so I think that when you look at it from that perspective, there are governments in the world, I would say the United States under its current administration, and quite frankly, its former administration. This isn't a pro-Republican, anti-Democrat situation. These administrations have had some serious concerns about the potential of an alternative currency. And they have done, I think, many things within their power to try and prevent that. And what's happened in the last year or so, in the United States anyway, is the rule of law applies. And so these, I guess, governmental agencies that have tried to hinder the progress of it or stop it have been sued in US courts, and they've lost. It's really that simple. The SEC didn't wake up one morning and think it was a great idea to have Bitcoin ETFs. They basically lost several court cases that prevented them from doing anything more to stop it. Because they're doing illegal things, and that's been proven in court. You can't without getting too deep into the weeds. What they were doing was illegal and wrong, and therefore they've been told they can't do that. So I just have to let my dog out. I'm sorry. Just give me one
Okay.
second. I will have to let her in again in a minute. Um, so from that perspective, yes, I think governments are are against Bitcoin in areas where they think it could affect them. Now, let's talk about the flip side of that for a second, though. You have other governments in the world embracing it. So, the US current administration might be against it. The European Central Bank is definitely against it. Christine Lagarde and all her friends. Um, but when people listen to people like that, I sometimes I think, well, listen to where it's coming from. So, Christine Lagarde, for instance, I don't know the lady personally, but I mean, she's a convicted felon. And for people that don't know, just Google it. She was a convicted felon just 5, 6 years ago. Now, I don't know that somebody who was convicted of the things that she was convicted of is who I'm going to take advice from in terms of she's trying to protect me. I don't think that's the case. I think people like her are trying to protect themselves. And I would say the same for people in the US that might be against something like that. Because the truth of the matter is, all over the world, the currencies that we're using are hurting us and have been probably since the dawn of central banking. So, yeah, another currency is probably not good for the central bankers and the governments of the world because they can't just print money out of thin air and basically hurt us with inflation, which is a tax, in my opinion. It's a silent tax. But when you look at some of the countries in the world that maybe don't control the money supply, like in El Salvador, which some people might not realize adopted Bitcoin as legal tender a few years ago, in conjunction with the U.S. dollar. It's not like Bitcoin's the only currency in El Salvador, but it is one of two. Countries like that, they've already realized that they're in trouble because they're beholden to anything the U.S. central bank does. So I think it works well for those countries. They're starting to realize that being on the U.S. dollar is far worse than trying a new currency that isn't under they're not under the thumb of central banks. So we'll see what happens in regards to legislation. We're seeing other countries maybe not adopt it as an official currency, but certainly are allowing its use to continue and grow and see what happens. And we're seeing that in several other countries in the world as well. So I guess we'll see what happens. But for now, I'm not convinced that anything can stop it because the government entities in the U.S. that have tried to stop it have lost in court, and that's that. So I'm just gonna let my dog back in.
Sure.
Sorry. So yeah, to your point, I think that a lot of people who stand to lose, like people like central banks or Wall Street banks or big international banks, they don't like Bitcoin. But that's because Bitcoin removes them from the equation. You don't need a central bank printing fake money when you have Bitcoin. You don't even, truth be told, because it's the technology of Bitcoin, you really don't need a bank at all. But that's probably a conversation for the next recording. But yes, I do believe that um, many governments and many large, powerful banking organizations in the world are not a big fan of the potential of Bitcoin.
You said that there's more news about regulation. So this is not just about the ETF approval. You see there's more things happening in terms of regulation?
Well, in the U.S., there's always stuff going on. Right now, I think, and I don't know a lot about this, but I know Ethereum, which is another crypto technology, is pushing for an exchange traded product or fund as well. We'll see whether that happens. It has different properties than Bitcoin, so I'm not convinced that will happen, but I'm not convinced it won't either. Um, and again, I think what this really shows is there's things happening in the world, changes through technology in all walks of life. But since we're talking about currency and money, um, these things are happening fairly quickly, and governments, I think, are slow to respond at the best of times, and in this case, probably slow and afraid and angered. But there's certainly people and companies and even some legislators out there that are saying, no, we need to move with the times. And an online digital money that is not printed into oblivion is something I think a lot of people, if they thought about, would really like the idea of, because nobody likes the fact that their purchasing power of their money keeps going down and down and down. So yeah, there is more on the table. Specific things I'm not that well versed on, but there's certainly a lot of industries and companies and individual people pushing for the right to have crypto, if you will, become a bigger part of their day-to-day lives. Yeah.
We said we're going to do a little bit like shorter recordings this time before we move into the next topic. Maybe we just leave it here for now and
Okay.
just say also goodbye to everyone who's watching and just tune in then into the next recording, I guess, where we're going to
Yeah.
talk some more about what happened in the last couple of years and what the ramifications are for people and why Bitcoin is important. So first of all, thanks a lot
Yes,
and
thank you.
continue the conversation in the next podcast.
Sounds great.